And if you look at Freud, um, obviously a pioneer in psychoanalysis and psychotherapy and psychiatry, psychology, I guess, more than psychiatry, but he used Greek myths for almost all of the things that he was trying to explain. He would say, "Oh, it's the Oedipal complex. Oh, it's the, the Antigone syndrome or whatever." He would use the myths. These characters are actually, we could set aside for a second the question whether these gods are real in another realm, because that's a very interesting question. But when you say you got inspiration from, something outside of yourself, or you heard the voice of heaven, or you heard the voice of the gods, where does that come from? Well, a psychologist might say, well, that came from your own head. Maybe it did, but maybe in some ways we're able to tap into something that almost seems beyond ourselves. And I think all of these gods, I think we play the role of, the wise King Solomon sometimes, but the foolish King Midas other times. And we can live up to our potential and be like, some of these more positive figures, whether it's a hero or a goddess or whatever, but we also seem to have parts of ourselves that act out some of the more malevolent or self-destructive type characters that we find in the myths too.
Are you curious about discovering ways of making your life better? Then welcome to my podcast. I'm Bob Nickman, and this is The Exploding Human. Listen in while I talk with all kinds of people in the fields of personal growth, health and healing, alternative therapies, psychology, spirituality, environment, and the future. I'm looking for those answers that make life better for everyone. You'll meet cutting-edge practitioners, doctors, artists, filmmakers, business people, and those who have overcome challenges, the brave, the curious, anyone who is out there helping us humans to explore, expand, and explode. Hey, welcome to The Exploding Human. My name is Bob Nickman, and today's guest is David Matheson, and we're going to be talking about mythology and the stars. Esoteric conversation today, so stay tuned for that. First, I'd like to invite you to visit my website, theexplodinghuman.com, and you can listen to all the episodes there, see photos of all my guests, read synopses of the episodes, a little bio on myself, and there's a donate button if you'd like to support the show. Thank you. I'd also like to invite you to subscribe for free to my YouTube channel, The Exploding Human with Bob Nickman. Add with Bob Nickman to find that YouTube channel. You can listen to all the episodes there and maybe even play around on your computer while you're listening to a great episode. It's a possibility. Check that out. As I was saying, today's guest is David Mathisen. David has spent many, many years studying mythology and its relationship to the constellations and the stars. All across the world, there's these uncanny similarities between how constellations are interpreted and the mythology around them. This holds true of the Bible and of many religions and cultures. And his study has brought these things together into this very, I'm going to call it an esoteric pursuit, because it really is about, from my perspective, getting a message, a universal truth from the stars. I found our talk very gratifying because it was something that I knew nothing about. And David's passion for this topic is absolutely fascinating. He showed me some artwork, which obviously you won't see audio-wise, but it is described a little bit in the talk. And we're also going to talk a little bit about his books. And open your mind to this one. This is a really interesting topic that I had no idea was even out there. So here we go. This is David Mathisen. Tell us a little bit about what you do, because people are probably wondering, what are you doing, Bob? Who is this guy?
Yeah, well, thanks again for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and I'm always interested to see what direction things will go and what new things will come out. But the way I try to explain it is the evidence that I'm exploring is the evidence which demonstrates or leads to the conclusion that virtually all of the world's ancient myths are based on the stars, are based on specific metaphors that are actually part of a worldwide system. So that's already kind of hard to grasp and flies in the face of kind of conventional paradigms. But the stories of the Greek myths, the Norse myths, the myths of ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, ancient India, even the sacred stories from the Americas, whether it's the Maya or the different nations of the North American Native Americans, in the myths of the Pacific, all the way, from Hawaii over to New Zealand, or Aotearoa, I think is the Maori name of New Zealand, ancient China, ancient Japan. I don't know if I mentioned ancient India, and, the Vedas, all the stories of the Sanskrit scriptures, Australia, Africa, the stories in the Bible, all are based on the specific characters and events can be shown to be based on specific constellations.
So the humans, well, maybe I'm wrong about this. Humans had to come up with these ideas of what these constellations represent, or is it the other way around? Did the constellations disseminate information in an esoteric kind of way where people went, "Oh, there's," you know what I'm saying? Because a lot of these myths are very similar.
That's a great point. I mean, it's a really good question. So I would argue that nobody knows. I certainly don't know the origin, but what I can tell you is it's already present in the most ancient texts that we've discovered in ancient Mesopotamia. Like the Gilgamesh stories are based on the same pattern. The ancient pyramid texts of ancient Egypt are mentioning characters like Osiris and Isis and the different gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt. And those myths are based on this same system. So the earliest known writings that we have are already using this system, which suggests that in the Vedas of India, very ancient, writings from China, very ancient. So it suggests that it may have come from something even more ancient than that. But you also bring up a really good point that there are these similarities, like we find characters like Zeus, or Jove, as he's called in the Latins, called him Jove or Jupiter. He has a certain set of characteristics. He's jolly. Our word jovial, relates to the name of Jove. He likes a feast. He likes, he's a benevolent kind of, but very powerful figure, and he has a short temper, so he can have a wrath and throw down thunderbolts. He's also amorous in the Greek myths. You might notice that Zeus is always seducing beautiful mortal women, and that's how Hercules or Heracles was born, and many other famous liaisons that Zeus had. So that pattern of wrathful but jovial is found in, for instance, in the Norse myths. There's a god who's also a thunder god, who has a thunderbolt weapon, a hammer, and he loves a good feast, and he loves to have a huge party and drink enormous amounts of ale, but he can fly into a rage at a moment's notice. Very similar characteristics. And in fact, we find that characteristic repeating itself around the world. We find thunder gods or rain gods who have a powerful weapon. Indra in the myths of ancient India has a thunderbolt weapon called the Vajra. And so it's a great question of where it came from, but the fact that it's worldwide is baffling in a way.
You know what it sounds like to me when I hear those characters? It sounds like male wish fulfillment. Like, that's the guy I want to be. And so maybe it's coming from that sort of male energy of, men sort of ruled stuff way back then. It seems like, at least that's what I've heard.
over the years. It's been a male-dominated planet. Hopefully, that'll be changing even more so. But the idea of this powerful god-like creature, or a powerful god-like God,
Yeah.
really, it's not a creature; it's a god that embodies the desires of a man, an earthly man, makes a lot of sense to me. Like that we would want that. It's like that's something to strive for as we walk around with these, on the earth plane, going, I can't get any chicks. What's going on?
Well, that's an interesting take, Bob.
It's my own feeling that there's a yearning to be part of something bigger than us, or maybe even to return to that from whence we came. I'll put it that way, and to create mythology around that is an important piece of organizing what seems to be a little chaotic and not graspable, if that's even a word, by humans. Um, and so there's a really big attraction to that, of making sense of something that really can't be made complete sense of on the plane that we operate on.
That's a perfect, I think not graspable is a great adjective that you just made.
Oh, okay. Well, let's put that in the
Yeah.
dictionary. I need credit for something before I get out of here.
I think that's a great way of putting it, because I know you've studied some Buddhism, or I've heard that on some of the interviews that I've listened to. And you just mentioned that you do a lot of meditation, and there's the kind of the concept of a koan, or maybe I'm not even pronouncing that right, but grasping something beyond kind of the logical part of our brain. And I like to use the metaphor of the Karate Kid with Mr. Miyagi, how he taught Daniel-san in it's an esoteric manner. He taught him something, and then he said, do you know what you just learned? And Daniel says, yeah, I learned how to wax all your cars, and when am I going to get to learn karate? And then he shows him, you actually know it. Before you understood it, you know it. And that's what happens with a story, like in a myth. You can be told a myth, and then you can be told the esoteric. It's esoteric. We often think of it as hidden, but actually there was an esoterist named Schwaller de Lubitsch, Alsatian. Schwaller was his name. Schwaller de Lubitsch. He was from, I guess, Alsatia. And he said, esoteric, it's not hiding it in order to hide it from you. It's hiding it in order to get to those, what you said, like non-graspable. You can't grasp it with your head intelligence, but your heart intelligence can grasp it. So we have to somehow bypass that choking, your brain will choke on it. Kind of like Daniel-san would have choked on it when Mr. Miyagi tried to show him. He would have said, oh, I don't know if that'll really work. He was full of doubts. He was full of insecurity. Mr. Miyagi had to bypass that. And then Daniel could grasp it in a totally different way, to grasp this concept that he was unfamiliar with, but by showing him something where he learned it in a esoteric way, where you learn something and then you learn what it really means.
It's all music, in a sense. I always like to use music analogies because yes, you can write down notes and you can write down all that technical stuff, but there is an element to music when you listen to it that cannot be written down. It is what it is. It's music, and and I don't care how carefully you notate any of that stuff, you're going to miss the thing that it is. It just can't be done. And to play it, you need to be there also. And I sort of look at the universe that way. There's some quantifiable things, and there's planets, and there's people, and there's this that, but there is a well, I think it was an Einstein thing. We dance to a strange and distant tune. And I think that's really what you're looking at with this stuff, that it's a sort of human manifestation in these stories of that tune.
It's not even an analogy. I mean, it's an analogy, but it's also, you're talking about like the truth of music. It's got something that has to just be grasped. There's a lot of things like this. It's a perfect analogy. And music involves time and rhythm, which kind of has to be grasped. And you mentioned the planets in this quotation, and the music of the spheres, the planets and their motions set our times, or our clocks are set off of the motions of our Earth and its interaction with the moon and the sun. And in ancient times, there were certain periods that were governed by the return of Saturn, to a certain place against a backdrop of stars every approximately 30 years. The ancient Egyptian pharaohs would actually have a special kind of ceremony of renewal when Saturn got back to a certain place. So we take the times from this celestial realm, but there's that time element, that rhythm element is, to me, a lot of the part that needs to be grasped. Like, I'm looking at your background and you're on a beautiful beach in Hawaii, in your background, and there's waves there. Well, waves have a frequency to them. They have a period to them. And if you're a surfer, you know that there's a rhythm that you have to grasp. Or if even skateboarding around in an empty pool, there's a place where you compress your body and there's a place where you extend your body. And someone else they can explain it to you as well as they can, but you eventually have to feel it, because there's no one else on that skateboard but you, or that surfboard but you. And it's the same as what you just described in music. And there's so many other things that are like that. And it has to be, it's like, I can't feel it for you. I can't even do it for you. So I'm going to give you this. Like Mr. Miyagi knew that Daniel-san had to feel it. Mr. Miyagi had already felt it. He knew that this worked, but Daniel had to somehow feel it. And Mr. Miyagi had to he couldn't feel it for Daniel, but he had to help Daniel to feel it for himself. And then he grasped it. And that's the esoteric teaching method.
Yeah, there's a point with all this stuff where you literally need to jump into the unknown and see what happens. That's really what it is. It's jumping right off a cliff into the dark and trusting this thing that you don't even know what it is to take you to the next thing. It really is I mean, that is a spiritual experience in a sense, to get up on a surfboard. And you always hear surfers say, that's my religion, is surfing. It's like music, it really is I just call it the thing.
Yeah.
That's what I call it.
And that's what I think the myths are really all about. That's what I think they're actually. So when you say you have to jump into the unknown, you have to put your faith in something. There are so many myths about a doubting figure. There's doubting Thomas in the New Testament, but there's many, many doubting figures. There's, in the Bhagavad Gita, big conversation between Arjun, who's this most powerful warrior, he's going into this great battle, and Krishna is his non-combatant charioteer, his divine charioteer. But Krishna has said, I'm not going to actually fight in this battle. So Arjun has to do it. And Arjun's been given every single tool that he needs. He's gone up into the heavenly realms, and different gods have given him different weapons that are just irresistible. But Arjun basically sits down on the ground and says, I don't think I can do this. I know I can do it physically, but I'm full of doubts. And Krishna basically spends the whole Bhagavad Gita exploring that with him and helping him overcome his doubts. In the Iliad, we see the greatest warrior on the side of the Greeks, or the Achaeans, is Achilles. And what's he doing? He's gone to his tent and he's just pouting. He doesn't want to help. And the Greeks just keep getting destroyed as long as Achilles is pouting in his tent. This is a pattern that we find in the myths around the world. And it's this, I have kind of wrestled with, what, if these are all built based on the stars, what does that mean for us? These doubting figures, we certainly have our own self-doubting figure. We're all familiar with that figure, but to overcome that is to get in touch with that higher self, the Krishna figure, or in Thomas's case, the Jesus figure, I believe, is not an external person or God man. It's your higher self. It's an illustration of overcoming that doubt and connecting with your own self that you already have, but that you suppress, and that suppressing holds you back, because your doubts basically don't help you live. They keep you from living up to your full potential. But when you're in that moment of like you said, the surfer who says, this is my religion, because he's in touch with himself at that point, or she, or when you got to get to that point where you're kind of the Daniel sign part, the doubting Daniel sign gets out of the way, and suddenly you're in touch with, whoa, I didn't even know I could do that.
Yeah, that's one of the best feelings in life. I didn't know I could do
Mhm.
that.
And I totally think the myths are illustrating that over and over. At least that's one purpose of the myths. We could argue, or people could argue with me and say that, well, don't reduce it to that. Well, I would say, first of all, it's not reducing it, because that's a pretty big thing. It may be one of the biggest things to, achieving what we're given all these gifts, but we self-sabotage ourselves in so many different ways. So I think it's a really big thing, but it's certainly one of the things that the myths are consistently talking about around the world.
When you talk about information coming from the stars and the myths coming from the stars, what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, obviously you're not going to be able to pinpoint it exactly, because it's a little bit vast.
Yeah, it's infinite. It's infinite.
But like I studied as a kid. They made us draw lines for constellations, and I honestly I couldn't stand it.
Yeah.
I'm like, this is so arbitrary and did not feel honest to me.
Yeah.
It just felt like somebody came up with this whole thing that to make kids learn stuff that wasn't really true.
Yeah.
Didn't feel true to me. Now, especially when I would go outside and well, I mean, I grew up in Ohio, so there was sometimes there was plenty of stars, but going out to like Colorado and places like that where there's no clouds at night, and you see this sea of lights that is so intense, you can feel it pulling on your body. It's so amazing if you're not used to it. And how are people like looking up there and going, oh, that's this myth, I'm going to draw a line from here to here? Doesn't that am I wrong in thinking that was just very, very arbitrary?
A great question that you're raising, Bob. And so the best way I can show you if you let me share my screen, I'll show you some things because this question gets right to, I would agree with you that it is very, very difficult to pick out, and the lines can be drawn in many, many different ways. A very important figure in world history, one of the most important authors of all time, in my opinion, who wrote this book called The Stars, A New Way to See Them. And I underlined it there on our visual because I think it's also a very ancient way to see them. But this book was first published in 1952, but it is still in print. This is, like, you can see in the upper right-hand corner, it says updated Planet Finder for 2016 on this.
Planet Finder.
But who is this author? Who is this character? H.A. Rey. He's mostly known for creating Curious George. There's an image I put on the screen of Curious George book, and there's his name on the cover. And he and his wife Margaret created this character, Curious George, after they basically escaped from Paris in the 1940s and came to first Brazil and then Greenwich Village. And he not only was an illustrator of Curious George, but he wrote this, he was lamenting the very thing that you're talking about, the way that we connect the dots on the stars. He said almost seems like it's designed to confuse or throw us off. And so he said, I'm going to do a better way. I'm going to do a more common sense way where you can actually find, like you said, you went out to Colorado, or you would go out in Ohio where you grew up, and you would look up in the sky and say, where, those lines that I was drawing in class, at least you got some instruction. Unfortunately, maybe it was designed to mislead because they were using the conventional outlines. I'm going to bring in some conventional outlines. Look at these things. And H.A. Rey says in his book, it's almost as if they're designed to throw us off. They're certainly useless for finding them in the sky because you can't even remember those outlines.
You can, not only can you not remember them, it's like, how do you know which
exactly
stars are the connecting stars and which aren't?
Completely arbitrary. Completely arbitrary.
Okay.
And this picture, this image, and this is out of a modern, very excellent star app called Stellarium. It's a planetarium type app that you can download. It's free, it's open source, but that is the constellation Aquarius that I've outlined. how that turns into a water bearer. Aquarius is this water bearing figure. H.A. Ray said, I don't know. It's like a geometric figure. Here's another one right next to it called the constellation Cetus. Cetus is the whale. You may have heard of cetaceans. If you read, Moby Dick, sometimes you'll call whales whales. Sometimes you'll call them leviathans. Sometimes you'll call them cetaceans, C-E-T, which this is the Latin word for a whale, cetus, the whale. But that thing doesn't look like a whale. It looks almost like
No, it looks like an embryo.
an embryo with a duck's head on the now. Be amazed as I switch the background to the outline system suggested by H.A. Ray. Exact same stars, exact same picture of the sky. It's just that's the outlining system that H.A. Ray suggested. And now Aquarius, we can see this figure of kind of a running human figure pitched kind of forward, almost as if he's running very fast and his upper body's tilted forward, and he's holding out in front of him this kind of water vessel, which has two streams of water pouring down. And you can see this in the sky. I can point this out in the sky. Sometimes I do at conferences and things. I take a laser pointer and show people the constellations, because for many people, it's the first time they can find Aquarius or Cetus. And now look at Cetus. It looks like a whale. Okay, so H.A. Ray came up with a better way, but couldn't we just draw the lines anywhere? And the answer is yes. This is kind of a criticism that people sometimes bring to me. Well, can't we draw the lines anywhere? And can't different cultures draw the lines in different ways? Yes, yes, and yes. The answer to all those is yes. But what's amazing about H.A. Ray's book, The Stars, A New Way to See Them, is I can show you ancient artwork from around the world, which suggests very strongly, I would say the evidence is at least compelling, if not conclusive, that the ancients were using the system that H.A. Ray divulged to the world in 1952.
So there was some sense of which stars were important in order to come up with these images, and that was translatable to artists who felt that was, because you said some of the stars are fainter than others, so it's not based on that. It's not based on distance or brightness or any of those things. It's based on some sort of a message that people were getting that was more important than other messages, which appear to be arbitrary.
Yeah, it's a really good, I wasn't there. All I can say is, for sure is what I can show here, that the ancient myths, it's not just artists too. So it's not just visual. We have traditions that are visual. The ancient Greeks left us lots of art on pottery and, statues,
Sculpture.
everything. Yeah, sculpture. But there are cultures that were anti-visual, that didn't want any representations made of the gods, but were very verbal and would have tremendous descriptions of things that were going on. I'm thinking of scriptures like in the Bible, what we call the Old and New Testaments. You can see by reading the texts that the Samson story or different episodes, whether it's in the Old or in the New Testament, are consciously or unconsciously, I don't know how, they are referring to this system, whether it's conscious or unconscious.
This is so hard for the mind to wrap around this. I know you do this all the time.
No, it's a challenge for me to try and.
But I'm like, my mind is going, I want to totally understand what this is. That's like trying to imagine infinity or something.
So let me show you a piece of artwork. This is not ancient artwork, but this is an ancient story. You may recognize the story. This is a piece of art that I'm putting up for those who are listening, by William Hogarth. He was actually a pretty famous artist in his time in Britain, England. He lived from 1697 to 1764. He did a lot of different subjects, but some of them were mythological. What he's doing here is he's rescuing the Princess Andromeda, who has been chained to a rock. You can see on her hands, there's a chain going up to the rock. She's been chained to the rock because her mother or her parents somehow insulted the god Poseidon, basically by saying that their daughter was more beautiful than one of the sea goddesses, the Nereids. And so he sent this monster called the Ketos to destroy the kingdom. And the monster was so terrifying and damaging that they finally said, what do we have to do to get rid of this monster? And they said, well, just chain your daughter to the rock. If the monster devours her, then Poseidon will be assuaged, Poseidon or Neptune, and the monster will stop. And so, yeah.
That's a heavy
Heavy
deal,
duty, yeah.
Somebody asked me to chain my daughter to a rock so a monster could eat her. I think I would think twice.
Right. And we have these kind of horrible, sometimes even bizarre things going on in myths. And I would argue they're all esoteric and they're all celestial. I think that many of us who are exposed to the myths as children but get told versions that cut out the difficult or bizarre parts of the myths may try to delve into the myths later on our own and run into some of these difficult or even bizarre aspects of the myths and get turned off or revolted by some of the stories, not realizing that they're based on celestial metaphor and that they're esoteric in nature, conveying a message using a language in which certain constellations and certain points on the great celestial cycles have esoteric meaning. Or we could try and take them literally, which is a mistake and leads to an inversion of their meaning in a lot of cases, I would argue. But to your point about sacrifices in the myths, we obviously don't just find that in the story of Andromeda. There's another story in the myths of ancient Greece about the great fleet of the warriors on their way down to the Trojan War. The fleet of the Greeks, but they aren't called the Greeks in the Iliad. They're called the Achaeans or the Argives or the Danaans. This story isn't actually in the Iliad, although they refer to this place where they sailed from. It was called Aulis, and there are ancient plays about this sacrifice at Aulis, one by Euripides, a famous play by Euripides, surviving play. But the fleet of the Greeks, the entire fleet is stuck because of weather. They can't sail because the winds aren't right. And the weather just continues to make it impossible for the fleet to sail. And so they finally ask a priest or a holy man what might be the problem. And they learn that the king, Agamemnon, has offended the goddess Artemis, and that in order to undo his error and correct what he did, he must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. There are different versions of the story, but in some of them, he's about to go through with the sacrifice when the goddess whisks Iphigenia away to safety and places a deer on the altar instead of the princess. In my book, Star Myths of the World, Volume 2, Greek Mythology, I've presented an argument that this story is celestial in nature. These stories can be shown to be based on celestial metaphor. Now, in this drawing of Perseus flying in with his winged sandals to save Andromeda from the sea monster, can you see how the scene matches the constellations in the heavens almost perfectly? The sea monster, of course, corresponds to the constellation Cetus, which is facing towards Aquarius. Perseus, in this particular episode, this particular scene, is associated with the constellation Aquarius. Aquarius is holding what appears to be a water vessel, or what's usually interpreted as a water vessel pouring out streams of water. But I've shown that in a great many myths from different cultures, this water vessel can also be envisioned as a severed head, streaming blood, or a severed head being carried in a satchel sometimes, or in a bag, in a purse. In this myth, Perseus carries the severed head of Medusa in a special bag given to him by the god Hermes, and he takes it and holds it out towards the sea monster while telling Andromeda to look away. He tells Andromeda to look away, then he takes the head of Medusa out of the bag, and the sea monster sees the head of Medusa and is turned to stone. And Andromeda is saved, and later she and Perseus are married. But you can see this dramatic scene in the stars themselves. In fact, although you can't see it in this particular star chart, the constellation Sagittarius is not far behind Aquarius. Sagittarius would be off to the lower right of the screen, just off the screen here. And I'm quite certain that in this particular scene, Sagittarius corresponds to Andromeda chained to the rock and turning her head to look away as Perseus holds out the head of Medusa to stop the approaching sea monster. You can see that artist William Hogarth has framed his artwork in a way that perfectly matches the scene in the heavens. But of course, this artwork is from the modern period, the early modern period, the early 1700s. But we also have surviving ancient artwork, which shows the very same scene. Here's an ancient piece of pottery, piece of ancient artwork showing Perseus confronting the sea monster. And we know it's Perseus because the ancient artist has actually written the word Perseus right here. The letters go from right to left instead of left to right. So in this case, you're going to start with the P on the right and read towards the left, and it says Perseus. Notice the special bag hanging from his leading arm. It's called the kibisis bag, or the kibisis bag, given to Perseus by the god Hermes for this particular mission of slaying Medusa. Without the help of the gods, Perseus wouldn't have been able to successfully accomplish his mission. Behind Perseus stands Andromeda, and once again we know that this is Andromeda because the ancient artist, or an ancient scribe who was with the artist, has written her name right next to Andromeda. Again, it goes from right to left. So if you start with the A on the right, you can see then there's an N, then a D or delta, then there's an R or rho, then there's a little O right here, and then this little letter right here is an M or mu, modern day mi in Greek, and then E, then D, then A, Andromeda. Finally, we also see the enormous face of the approaching sea monster, leering at Perseus and Andromeda. Again, the ancient artist has labeled the monster, but this time the letters go from left to right. K-E-T-O-S, Ketos or Ketos. That's the name of the ancient sea monster in the ancient records that talk about this myth. It's called the Ketos, the sea monster that's sent to devour Andromeda. And here we have confirmation that this interpretation, our interpretation of the celestial foundations of this mythical episode, is a correct interpretation, because that is the same name as the constellation to this day, Ketus or Cetus, the whale.
You get into this stuff. I was reading, I think on your bio, that you went to West Point.
That's true.
Correct?
Yeah, long
So you're like
ago.
a military trained guy in some sense, and now you're into this esoteric stuff. What was the?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to get personal here for a second. What was the impetus?
Yeah. So certainly in the military, you do spend a lot of time under the stars. You're out in the woods or out on the ground. I was in the infantry, outside, no tent, slogging around or lying in the ground holding a rifle. And the stars are sometimes spectacular. But I was always into the myths when I was little. I was always into the stars. Actually, my dad took me out to see the stars. And the books that we used were the ones by H.A. Rey. I wasn't particularly religious. I wasn't brought up in a particularly religious, we would go to church sometimes. I did become very literalist Christian as an adult in the Army as a result of various factors going on. And so I became very strict about reading the Bible. Like on Sundays, I would not read anything but either the Bible or commentaries on the Bible. Even when I was getting my master's degree and I had lots of other things to do, I wouldn't read, the books that I was supposed to be reading for school on a Sunday. So I did become very familiar with the Bible. And later, so there are other people who have put forth this thesis. In fact, it goes all the way back to Plato, I think, was even hinting at it in some of his dialogues. But there's a book called Hamlet's Mill, which alleges a lot of these things, but they weren't using the H.A. Rey outline, so they could grasp at it, but they couldn't really match it up. But that really fascinated me when they were saying, well, the Greek myths, the Vedas, all these can be shown to be based on some ancient system. When they talked about the Bible being based on it, I got very uncomfortable. I said, no, I can't possibly be right. Samson was a really strong guy. literal. Don't tell me that it was celestial metaphor. But the more I kind of became almost obsessed with it. There's other researchers who are saying things like, look at the architecture of ancient Egypt, and yet we find the same kind of ratios in pyramids in the Americas. And conventional history would say, well, there's no way they're connected, because we know there's no connection between the Egyptians and the pyramids in the Americas, or the pyramids. By the way, there's pyramids in China, but there's archaeological evidence that points to some ancient culture that predates Egypt. And yet we're not allowed to even consider that as a possibility. But here there's also mythological evidence that somehow this is a worldwide system.
What I'm kind of getting out of this whole study that you do and that you're talking about here is that there is a universal truth that permeates our existence, that is inescapable and valid, and it feels like it's a message that is coming from the source. I think I just call it the source. That's what it feels like. And I've read about, I used to read a lot of this P.D. Ouspensky and Gurdjieff kind of materials back when I was in my 20s. Kind of overwhelmed me a little bit, but Gurdjieff would talk about artwork that was basically a message of truth that transcended any time period, that if you could see it in the way you're talking about seeing these constellations, that you would get this message that the artist intended, that came from the universe.
That's a really powerful observation. And it's amazing, because I was just talking about, other researchers who have looked at these archaeological evidence. And one of them, the late, great John Anthony West, he just passed away in early 2018, but I had an opportunity to meet him and talk with him, kind of, some long conversations. And he was the kind of the impetus for the examination of the Great Sphinx and its antiquity. He was saying, look, the Sphinx looks like it's much, much older based on the weathering than even the ancient Egyptian civilization. But the reason I bring him up, from what you said, we were just talking about the archaeological evidence, but then you just brought up Gurdjieff. And he, in my personal conversations with John Anthony West, would say basically that was his lifelong study was what Gurdjieff was trying to impart. That was his guiding light as well.
Wow. Okay. Well, I guess maybe I'll go back and read some, because I was probably a little too crazy and a little too young to really let it seep in fully. And I had some people that were studying that those disciplines, and they were annoying to me. So I kind of steered away and went into some other things.
I'm not an expert in it, but I do believe that these esoteric traditions around the world are teaching the same thing from different ways.
Yes.
And I can show that even the stories of the Buddha, there's certain traditions about the birth of the Buddha, how his mother dreamed of an elephant, or, he had these 3 ponds with water lilies and lotuses in them, and things like that, can be shown to be based on the stars. Which
of your books are these? Can people see some of these pieces of artwork? Because they're really incredibly interesting.
I would really recommend probably my most recent 2 books. One is called The Ancient Worldwide System. That was 2019. And then my most recent one is called Myth and Trauma, which is getting into the psychological aspects of it, of course. Trauma means being separated from yourself. That's what trauma does. It separates you from yourself. And I would argue that these myths are actually there to help us recover ourselves. In fact, we've almost all of us, modern healers like Peter Levine or Gabor Mate, talk about trauma as being almost universal in modern society. And I am convinced that the ancient myths are pointing us the way to recover ourselves. So Myth and Trauma is my most recent, and Ancient Worldwide System, but really all of them do have pictures. There's one that's all on the Greek myths. Volume 2 is all Greek myths. Volume 3 is Star Myths of the Bible.
That actually brought me to what was going to be my final question: is what is this really about? And you just said it: recovering ourselves.
I'm convinced that's
All
what it's about.
That's a beautiful thought. That is a beautiful thought. I love that. I don't want to go past that.
Perfect.
One, because we're out of time, but two, because it's a great thought. It's so all this is about recovering ourselves and being part of the vastness and the thing that we can't really say what it is, but we know what it is, as you were saying.
Perfect. It's perfect.
And let's plug your website, because there's great information and books and all that. So it's David, which is spelled the way you'd spell it, and then spell your last name.
It's M as in Mike, A-T-H, so Mathisen. So military, that'd be Mike Alpha Tango Hotel, India Sierra Echo November. Does that help?
Victor Tango Zulu 0994.
Yeah, but you can search for my last name, Matheson, and stars. My website is called Star Myths of the World, which the URL is starmythworld.com, and you can find that on Instagram too for those who use that. It's Star Myth World.
It's really cool. I went to it and checked it out today, and some really great photos, and I was reading about the Buddha and all that kind of stuff. That's a whole other episode for another day, I think.
Yeah,
but,
thank you for checking it out. It does have a blog. It's got a blog that's searchable, so you can search for names like Buddha or Thor or Vajra.
Well, thanks so much for all this amazing information. It's I wasn't sure I was going to be able to keep up, but I think I kind of
thank
did.
you.
And I learned stuff.
No, thank you. You're a wonderful host, Bob. I've really enjoyed listening to some of your interviews. You bring out, some new things that I've never talked about. Your questions are fantastic, and your interaction was fantastic. And I think you got it. This is for all of us.
I got it going on.
When you said I wasn't sure I was going to get it, this is for all of us. It's like it's for everyone. I'm convinced it's for everyone. It can certainly help everyone. I'm convinced. So thank you so much for helping me share.
Have a great evening, and I appreciate your time. Thanks David.
Bob.
Well, folks, thank you so much for listening in to The Exploding Human. Check out my website, theexplodinghuman.com. Please subscribe to the YouTube channel, The Exploding Human with Bob Nickman. And big thanks again to David Matheson. Please go to his website, check out his books. Fascinating stuff. Big thanks. Big thanks. And you guys have a fantastic day.